Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran. Today we'll be taking a look at Subtlety Rogue, and if it's worth getting any kind of hope for Subtlety when it comes to Shadowlands, primarily from a PvE perspective. Subtlety has been a very strong competitor within PvP for Battle for Azeroth. However, within the raiding and dungeons, it really fell off since the very first season. Now, is there any hope to getting excited for Subtlety for Shadowlands? From the perspective of where most of us play, the dungeons and the raids, and is Subtlety looking like an exciting spec worth picking back up in the next expansion? I want to take a look at Subtlety a little bit more closely and tell you guys in terms of how it feels to play Subtlety currently on Shadowlands. Now, we are in the early alpha. There's a good chance this spec, as well as many others, are going to go through a transition and many changes. So let's not pretend like this is going to be the final version of Subtlety. But rather, let's take a look at Subtlety in a snapshot. In the current version of the alpha, how does spec play? How does it feel? What are the good parts and the bad parts about it? And what is the general purpose and focus for this spec, especially going into Shadowlands? And it feels like Blizzard developers in particular wanted to tackle the focus of Subtlety rogues and what their playstyle is supposed to be, rather than having it be very loosey, kind of how it is right now in Battle for Azeroth. The first thing I could say about Subtlety compared to BFA is Blizzard decided to take certain mechanics through either talents or certain playstyles that people enjoy to reorganize Subtlety. Right now in Battle for Azeroth, it really feels like craft your own spec type of build just by taking a look at the talents. You have certain core abilities that are just kind of a must-have pick that you need to play in Battle for Azeroth if you want to be even close to competitive. And you essentially have to take certain talents in a combination if you want to achieve specific damage and specific numbers. But in Shadowlands, however, you don't have to take any of these talents. Rather, you have certain playstyles like Find Weakness being removed off of the talent bar and added as a base ability with other complexities around it in order to create more focus on the spec. Everybody likes Find Weakness, so let's aggressively attack it and try to find a way to make the spec play around it. Let's find more creative ways for you to apply Find Weakness to enemies. Simple ability where using abilities from stealth will allow you to bypass 30% of enemies' armor. You could easily make a spec around it. But Blizzard went a step further. Backstab crits can now proc a shorter version of Find Weakness. It won't last 18 seconds, but 8 seconds of extra Find Weakness on critical strikes is not a bad deal. But Blizzard took it a step further. What if you could find a way to apply Find Weakness in an AoE situation? Well, why don't we break that same crit mechanic into Shirk and Storm for Subtlety rogues as well? Really make Find Weakness a base mechanic and a core mechanic of what the spec will be about. Critting on enemies isn't all that difficult, and Find Weakness offers quite a good debuff. Essentially, it means you're trying to fish for a crit in order to be able to create this opportunity of extra damage. But what if you were to take it even further? Why fish for crits or fish for being able to hit an enemy with a Shadow Strike from a Vanish, Stealth, or Shadow Dance? Why don't you add a way to make that crit a guarantee? And Blizzard was able to do that by baking that into Symbols of Death. After using Symbols of Death, your next combo point generator, be it Backstab, Shadow Strike, Shirk and Storm, will be 100% crit. So now you have a playstyle of abilities linked to one another that create a new loop for you to play in between. The Find Weakness and how you proc it will now be able to give the spec a bit more focus. Now you know what stats are going to be a little bit stronger, and Critical Strike now serves a purpose besides just going for big explosive numbers. The second thing Blizzard did is took care of Shadow Dance, because ask yourself right now, what is the current purpose of Shadow Dance in Battle for Azeroth? Is it there to do damage? Well, if you're talented in a certain way, yes, like going for Dark Shadow, you might be able to get a little bit more damage out of your Shadow Dance. But if you go for Envelop in Shadows, you don't get the same damage opportunity. Shadow Dance in Battle for Azeroth doesn't offer any kind of extra buff to it. It just gives you access to stealth-based abilities and other effects that come from stealth. So what the hell is the purpose of Shadow Dance? You can Shadow Strike, and I guess your Shirk and Storm does a bit more damage, but seriously, what were they thinking? I mean, when you look at it, it's a pretty bare-bones ability. So Blizzard added more focus to what Shadow Dance is supposed to be. In Battle for Azeroth is too much a Build-A-Bear workshop, so let's create a bit more focus to the spec. Shadow Dance should be a damage cooldown. So if you were to take away all the talents that buff Subtlety Rogue Shadow Dance in terms of the raw damage, what does Shadow Dance read? allows you access to stealth-based abilities, and increases damage baseline by 15%. Well, now you have a spec where you have talents that can complement this playstyle. You want to have that 15% extra damage and cheaper cost abilities, so you can use Shadow Focus talent in order to really get all your Shadow Strikes through? Or would you rather go for a Night Stalker build, rather just save up all that energy and do more damage in the long run? Do you want more updates to your Shadow Dances to have more of them that all do good damage, with Enveloped Shadows giving you an extra charge? Or do you want to just have one charge of Shadow Dance to bank for the most amount of damage using Dark Shadow? Now this actually opens up playstyles for the specs, because finally the talents start to complement an existing focused playstyle of what Subtlety is supposed to be. Now how does Subtlety play when all these abilities are combined together? I think out in the open world, it probably exemplifies the best way that Subtlety, I always imagine, that would be played. Stalking around in the shadows, ambushing enemies out of nowhere, surprising them, and then bursting down very quickly. It's a spec that's all about trying to manage your cooldowns as best as possible. In a sense, you're like a one-man heist movie, and the plan comes together when all the cooldowns come together, and it really is up to the player and the abilities they choose in the moment to create this opportunity for themselves. You exploit the enemy's weaknesses by ambushing them out of nowhere and then trying to do as much damage while the enemy is down on their wits, and that's always been fun. In terms of the actual gameplay, it's a spec that has a little bit of a sustained playstyle to it, but primarily focuses on the big burst damage within short cooldowns. And the fact that Blizzard is able to better narrow when you should be doing damage, like lining up your Shadow Dance together with Symbols of Death a lot more regularly, it tells you that this spec is like a 30-second spec. Every 30 seconds you do the most amount of damage, and outside of that you can kind of maintain buffs and debuffs. And there's a lot more you can maintain, from your bleed to slice and dice, which is being added into the game to give you something extra to do while you're waiting for your Shadow Dance windows, which at least fills globals. But not only does it fill globals, it helps out with the sustain, where Subtlety usually kind of struggles in. Even adding the ability for you to have an AoE finisher, while not the strongest finisher I've ever seen, gives Subtlety at least something to do. If you are ambushed by a variety of enemies and everyone needs to be DPS down equally, Subtlety can finally start doing that. However, you still have the option of using your Shuriken Storm to generate the combo points, but you don't necessarily have to dump those combo points from AoE into an AoE finisher. You could repurpose those combo points into powerful eviscerates to better single target an enemy, which always felt that it was a better playstyle, but now at least Blizzard gives you choices. At least they give you tools to choose how you want to play this spec. The return of poisons for all three specs of rogues feel great. In terms of my Outlaw, I love the fact that I finally have poisons. Even though they're not going to be a huge portion of my gameplay, having a poison to rely on for the passive slow is a lot better. And it's even better than what Subtlety used to have to do, where you put up a Nightblade and then backstep to apply the slow, or I guess you could Shadow Strike too, but finally it's a 50% slow. Mind Numbing Poison is also kind of fun, and I think it's going to be great for rogues in dungeons and raids where you have enrage effects going off. Trust me, even to this day, with so many of my guildies playing druids and hunters, nobody de-enrage the adds when they start chewing through your tanks. So for rogues, I feel like it's an extra utility for us to bring, having Crippling Poison and Mind Numbing Poison. Mind Numbing also seems to be pretty well against caster-based enemies, so as a rogue in dungeons or in raids, our first enemy should always be the caster to help our tanks mitigate the amount of damage they're going to take from a variety of casts by slowing them down by a hair. And there's so many ways that the Covenant abilities themselves could influence the specs, and I think certain abilities are going to be better depending on the spec. But right now we don't have the access to all of them, but the ideas behind Subtlety being a mastery finisher heavy, using a Covenant ability that's all about the execute finisher damage might be a lot more valuable for this spec in particular. For a little bit, Blizzard tried to make Subtlety feel more like a ninja spec by giving you abilities like Shuriken Throw and Shuriken Storm, and I guess in a sense you still have access to certain aspects of it, like double Shadow Step is still in the game. Shadow Strike will teleport you behind the enemy from stealth, so it gives you ability to reposition. But a lot of this fantasy doing shadow damage over time kind of deal, that has faded. I don't really know if that's actually going to change the playstyle. Like having Nightblade that's a shadow based damage or Rupture that's a bleed based damage, I don't think that's going to make the difference in terms of how you play the spec at all. I think where that will really affect the spec is its consistent damage. So when you're not blasting the enemy with a bunch of eviscerates, something like a Rupture might be better for the more sustained based playstyle. So between the same defensives that you have, like Cloak of Shadows evasion, nothing different there. Concoction is still there in order to get you a quick heal, although this heal has been nerfed since the beginning. You have access to poisons and the ability of Shift to put on a more empowered version of those poisons, the mass mobility that Subtlety brings, a little bit of consolidation for a little more AoE output for Subtlety, and now more focus into the playstyle itself. I feel overall together it's a much better spec, at least a much better compared to a Battle for Azeroth version of Subtlety. And maybe it's too early to say that the spec is good because we don't have the numbers yet. We don't have add-ons like Recount anymore to look at the damage of the spec. All we can really go off of are the playstyles and how it feels to play the spec. Do the playstyles feel coherent? Is there some sort of synergy within abilities? What feels right, what doesn't? And I would say that the current version of Subtlety on the alpha feels good to play. BFA version of Subtlety for PvE always felt sloppy. There's always something that just didn't line up quite right. There's always an ability that was just a little bit off CD. There's always something that just didn't quite properly work. It was very, very close to feeling really coherent, and you can do some damage in Battle for Azeroth, but it just didn't really feel good. But the version of Subtlety that we're playing, at least on Shadowlands right now in the current playstyle, feels like things are lining up okay in terms of the basic loop and the basic playstyle. It feels like the abilities you're using have a purpose now, and with Blizzard actually giving you more focus to the spec, it really does finally feel like a choice when it comes to choosing which talents you want to run with. So if anything, I want to give you guys a little bit more of a hopeful message when it comes to sub, because it really does feel quite great when it comes to dungeons, when it comes to questing, when it comes to approaching different fights, and when it comes to experimenting with your builds. It's kind of fun, but definitely a lot more focused. There is a specific playstyle, so if you like the current malleability of Subtlety to be able to play all these different playstyles, it seems that Blizzard is going to kind of go in the other direction, or at least little by little. But the spec itself should still be a very powerful spec and a very strong competitor, and we haven't even talked about the PvP side of the spec, which I feel for the most part should stay about the same. There's only one big change, which cheap shot and only generate 1 common point instead of 2 common points, which is going to feel a little bit weird for the spec, but we haven't taken a look at the numbers, and I don't want to address it from a PvP perspective quite yet, again because the spec isn't finalized. This is a more generalized view, and I felt like the best way to do it was to take a look at the spec from dungeons and raid perspective. Not saying the Subtlety is making a huge comeback, but definitely hopeful about it, and so far it feels pretty great to play. Anyway guys, thank you so much for checking out this video. I don't know how many of you guys were excited about Sub-Rogue, but a lot of you guys watch my videos on the rogue aspect of the game, and Subtlety is part of the specs that some of you maybe play right now. A good portion of you are probably just slaying people in PvP as Subtlety, which is kind of where it's king, but in dungeons and raids it's been kind of really bad. So going from Battle for Azeroth Subtlety in dungeons and raids to Shadowlands Subtlety, I would say is a massive improvement, but that's just for any of you guys that are hopeful trying to pick back up Subtlety when it comes to the brand new expansion. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. You let me know what your thoughts on Subtlety right now on Shadowlands, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.